It starts in a place that doesn't look like it should remember anything. Amherst, Nova Scotia. Late 1800s. A small town wrapped in cold air and quiet routines where mornings arrive slowly and nights feel even longer. The kind of place where people know each other's names, but not their stories, and where most days pass without anything ever really changing. Back then, no one in Amherst was looking for anything unusual. There was no reason to. Life was built on repetition work, weather, illness, sleep. If something went wrong, it usually had a simple cause, or at least people preferred to believe. It did, and that's what makes what happened here so difficult to place, because it didn't begin with noise or violence. It didn't begin with anything anyone would immediately recognize as wrong. It began quietly, inside a wooden house on Gaspereau Street, where a 19-year-old girl named Esther Cox was staying while she recovered from an illness no one could fully explain. At first, nothing about her situation seemed unusual for the time. Weakness, fatigue, moments of fear that came without warning. The kind of symptoms that didn't fit neatly into any one category. And in the 1800s, often didn't get much further than a vague label and a hope that they would pass on their own. So she was placed in a quiet home with family in a town that didn't expect anything strange to happen there. For a while it didn't. Then the house started making small sounds in the walls. It started in a place where nothing was supposed to happen. Amherst, Nova Scotia in the late 1800s was the kind of town people forgot about unless they lived there. Cold wind, wooden houses, smoke rising in straight lines from chimneys. The kind of place where life was hard, but simple. People believed in weather, work, sickness, and death. Not ghosts. Not things that moved in the dark without explanation, but that belief was about to collapse. And it didn't begin with violence. It began with a girl who couldn't stay well. Her name was Esther Cox. She was 19 years old when everything started. Not someone important, not someone who stood out. Just another young woman trying to recover from an illness no one could fully explain. She'd been sick for a long time already. Weakness that came and went. Sudden panic for no reason. Exhaustion that didn't match anything physically wrong. With her, doctors in the 1800s didn't have much language for that, so they used words like nervous condition, hysteria, stress. Things that explained nothing but sounded like they did. Esther had gone to stay with her sister's family in Amherst. To recover, a quiet place, a safe place. At least that's what everyone believed at the time, at first. Nothing seemed wrong. Then came the sounds. It started with tapping in the walls of the house. Light at first. Easy to ignore. Wood settles, houses shift, pipes move. That was the explanation. Everyone used but then the tapping repeated. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 knocks again. Not random. Not scattered. The same pattern over and over. It was most noticeable at night when the house was quiet enough that even breathing felt loud. People would lie awake listening, trying to convince themselves it meant nothing. Then it began responding. If someone knocked once, the wall answered. If someone spoke, there would sometimes be a delayed knock in return. It wasn't consistent enough to prove anything, but it was consistent enough to disturb people, because it felt like something was learning within. Days, the house stopped feeling empty. Objects began shifting slightly. A cup left on a table would appear somewhere else in the room. A chair would be turned just enough to notice it had moved, but not enough to explain how it happened without doubt creeping in. That's how it always starts in cases like this. Small changes that can almost be ignored. Just small enough to argue about. Just large enough to remember. Then came the message. Scratched into the wooden wall of the house were 3 words. I am here. No one saw it being written. No one heard anything carve it into the wood. It simply appeared. And after that, everything changed. The house no longer felt like a place people lived in. It felt like something that was aware of them. At first, the family tried to stay calm. They called neighbors. They brought in witnesses. People came in skeptical, expecting explanations they could understand. But the phenomenon didn't behave like trickery. It didn't repeat on command. It didn't react to expectations. It reacted. To Esther, when she was calm, things were quiet. When she became anxious, the activity increased. When she cried, the house became violent. Knocking turned into banging. Objects began moving faster. Doors slammed hard enough to shake the walls. Beds trembled as if something underneath them was trying to get out. It wasn't random. It was focused. Always centered around her. Then came the fire. No one ever agreed on exactly how it started. Some said accident. Some said something worse. What is certain is that the house caught fire suddenly, without clear cause, and panic spread fast enough that people barely escaped with what they were wearing. The house was damaged, partially destroyed. But whatever had been inside, it did not stop. Because after the fire, the activity didn't end. It followed Esther, even when she left, even when she stayed with other families, even when she tried to escape the situation entirely, the same patterns returned. Knocking, movement, responses to her emotional state. It was no longer tied to a house. It was tied to her. And that is where people stopped asking if it was real. They started asking what it was watching. After the fire, something changed in how people looked at Esther Cox. At first, there was sympathy. A young woman going through illness, stress, and now the destruction of a home. But that sympathy didn't last long once the pattern started. Again, because the strange events didn't stay behind in Amherst. They followed her. Esther moved in with other families, trying to regain some kind of normal life, but normal never came back. The knocking returned first. At night. When the house was quiet, it would begin again. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. Exactly the same pattern as before. Not random, not accidental, familiar. Then the movement started again. 2. Objects shifting when no one was near them. Chairs turning slightly between moments of observation. Small things at first, the kind that made people question their memory more than the environment. But the activity escalated. Quickly, once again, doors would slam without wind or force behind them. Items would fall off shelves without being touched. Sometimes, objects wouldn't just move, they would be thrown. And every time it happened, it seemed to respond to Esther's emotional state. When she was calm, the activity slowed. When she became distressed, it intensified. When she panicked, it became aggressive. It wasn't random. It wasn't background noise. It was reaction. At this point, people around her stopped trying to ignore it and started documenting it. Witnesses were brought in again. Neighbors, skeptics, and even local authorities began observing what was happening inside the houses she stayed in. And what they saw was difficult to explain away. Objects moved without contact. Knocking came from inside walls and furniture. In some cases, items appeared to be pushed with force strong enough to bruise if they struck someone. But the most unsettling part wasn't the violence. It was the timing. Everything responded to Esther. If she left a room, the activity often paused. If she returned, it resumed. If she became emotional, the phenomenon seemed to escalate, as if it was feeding off that change. People began to whisper something. They didn't say out loud at first that it wasn't just haunting a place anymore. It was following her. Eventually, skepticism turned into investigation. Some believed it was trickery. Others believed Esther was somehow causing it without realizing it. A few thought it might be deliberate deception. So they tested her. They placed her under watch. They stayed in rooms with her. They tried to eliminate any possibility of her physically causing the disturbances, and still, it happened. Objects moved when she was fully observed. Sounds came from walls when no one had access. Even when her hands were restrained or she was held in place, the activity did not stop. That was the moment doubt began to break down, because if she wasn't doing it consciously, and no one else could be doing it, then something else had to be responsible. The situation escalated further when investigators began reporting stronger manifestations. Banging that shook entire rooms, furniture moving with enough force to shift, across floors, objects flying across space with no visible cause. And still, it always centered around her. At times, it even seemed to react to speech. Certain words spoken near her would trigger activity. Certain emotional tones would intensify it. It was no longer just unexplained movement. It behaved like something that was paying attention, and slowly, the focus of fear shifted. Not toward the house, not toward the rooms, but toward Esther herself. Because the question stopped being, what is happening here? And became something far more uncomfortable. What is connected to her? By the time word spread beyond local towns, the Amherst case had stopped being a private disturbance. It had become something people traveled to see. Skeptics, clergy, journalists, and curious onlookers began arriving to witness the events firsthand. And what they expected was a hoax that would fall apart under observation, but what they found was harder to dismiss because the activity didn't weaken. When more people were watching, it intensified. Objects would move in full view of groups of witnesses. Knocking would come from inside walls and floors, even when people had their hands pressed against the surfaces. Furniture shifted with enough force that multiple adults struggled to hold it in place. And always. The pattern remained the same. It centered around Esther Cox. At times, it felt almost deliberate in how it behaved. If someone mocked her, the activity would escalate. If someone spoke calmly to her, it would sometimes quiet down. If she became frightened or overwhelmed, the disturbances became more aggressive. This led some witnesses to a disturbing conclusion, that it wasn't just random chaos. It was responsive, and that changed how people treated Esther in the house. She was no longer just a girl staying with relatives. She became the focal point of every experiment, every observation, every attempt to understand what was happening. Then came the accusations. Some people began to believe she was secretly causing the events, that she was hiding some method of trickery, that everything could be explained if they just caught her at the right moment. So they intensified their testing. They watched her constantly. They placed her in controlled situations. They removed objects she could potentially manipulate. They even held her physically in place during some disturbances, trying to eliminate the possibility of physical interference. But the phenomena continued. Regardless, objects still moved in rooms where she was restrained. Knocks still came from inside walls when she had no access. Items still shifted or flew even when she was fully observed, and that is where the situation shifted. Again, because now it wasn't just about belief or disbelief. It was about control. If Esther wasn't doing it consciously, then something else was. And if something else was, then it was intelligent enough to avoid detection. Witness accounts from this period describe the activity becoming more forceful and erratic. Chairs sliding across floors with speed. Objects striking walls or people. Doors slamming with enough strength to shake entire structures. In one instance, items were reported moving in direct response to verbal provocation, as if reacting to insults or challenges spoken aloud. The idea that something might be listening became harder to dismiss, but there was still no agreement on what it meant. Some believed it was psychokinetic ability triggered by stress or trauma. Others believed it was external, something attached, something unseen, something that had followed her from the beginning. And a few simply stopped trying to explain it at all. Because no explanation seemed to fully contain what they were witnessing. What remained consistent was only one thing. Where Esther went, it followed. And as the activity escalated, so did the fear that whatever was present was no longer just reacting. It was learning. By the time the Amherst case reached its peak, it was no longer just a strange local story. It had become something people traveled to witness, almost like an experiment no one fully trusted, but everyone wanted to see with their own eyes. Word had spread beyond the town itself. Reports of the disturbances reached investigators, clergy, and curious skeptics who believed they could expose fraud. In the late 1800s, cases like this were often treated as either deception or delusion. There wasn't much room for anything in between. So they arrived expecting an explanation. What they found instead was something that refused to behave consistently enough to be disproven. When observers entered the house where Esther was staying, the activity did not stop. In fact, it often became more noticeable when more people were present. This alone created tension among the witnesses because it removed the simplest assumption that fear or imagination was exaggerating events. Objects moved in full view of multiple people, not subtle shifts or questionable recollections, but clear physical movement. Chairs slid across wooden floors without contact. Small items were lifted and dropped as if something invisible was testing their weight. Doors slammed hard enough to vibrate through entire rooms, even when no wind or physical force could account for it. And always, there was a pattern. Everything seemed to orient around Esther Cox. At first, some observers tried to map it as coincidence. They separated her from the environment. They watched rooms without her present. They monitored her reactions closely when she entered or left a space. But the pattern kept repeating in ways that became harder to ignore. When Esther was calm, the disturbances lessened. When she became distressed, the activity increased. When she was frightened, the intensity rose sharply. It wasn't just correlation anymore. It behaved like response. This led to a shift in attitude among some of the witnesses. What had begun as curiosity began turning into discomfort, even unease. Because if the environment was reacting to her emotional state, then something in the environment was paying attention, not just acting, responding. That idea created division among the people observing the case. One group believed Esther was unknowingly responsible, that she might be the source of the activity through psychological or physical means that were not understood at the time. Another group believed she was actively deceiving everyone, carefully manipulating the environment when people were not looking. And a smaller group began considering something far more unusual, that the activity was external and independent of her, but connected to her presence in a way that could not yet be explained. To resolve this, investigators began increasing the level of scrutiny. Esther was placed under constant observation. People stayed in the same room as her for extended periods. Some accounts describe attempts to eliminate every possible opportunity for concealment or trickery. Furniture was moved away from walls. Objects were removed from her reach. In some cases, she was physically restrained or held in place while observers watched closely for any sign of deception. And still, the phenomena continued. Knocking came from inside walls and floors even when she was fully observed. Objects shifted in sealed or controlled environments. Items fell or were thrown in ways that could not be easily linked to physical interaction. The consistency of these reports began to weaken the confidence of even the most skeptical observers, because the conditions they were imposing were designed to eliminate fraud, and yet the activity remained unchanged at this point. The disturbances escalated further. Witnesses described furniture moving with more force than before, chairs sliding rapidly across rooms without contact, items striking walls with enough impact to leave visible marks or create loud, resonant sounds that could be felt as much as heard. Doors would slam violently even when held or blocked by multiple people. There are also reports of targeted movement, objects appearing to respond to specific individuals in the room. In some cases, items would move in direct relation to spoken comments, particularly when those comments were mocking, skeptical, or emotionally charged. This created an uncomfortable realization among those present. The activity was not just centered on Esther. It was interacting with the people around her as well. The idea that something might be aware of the environment it was operating in became harder to dismiss, and yet there was still no agreement on what that meant. Some insisted it had to be fraud, even if the method was unclear. Others believed it was a psychological or physical phenomenon tied to Esther's condition. A few believed it represented something entirely outside known categories of explanation, but all of them agreed on one thing. It did not behave randomly. It behaved consistently, and consistency, in cases like this, is often more disturbing than chaos, because chaos suggests lack of control. Consistency suggests intent. As the investigation continued, the focus increasingly shifted from the environment to Esther herself, not because she was proven responsible, but because she remained the only constant element in every reported event where she went. The disturbances followed. When she left, they diminished. When she became emotional, they intensified. And when she was placed under direct observation, they did not stop. This led to one of the most controversial phases of the entire case: attempts to test her under stricter and more controlled conditions. Observers began designing situations intended to remove any possibility of hidden manipulation. Rooms were cleared, items were secured. Groups of witnesses were positioned to maintain continuous observation. In some cases, Esther was placed in physically restrictive conditions while people watched for any change in the environment. What they were trying to determine was simple in theory. Was she causing it, or was something else responding to her? But the results did not become clearer. They became more confusing, because even under conditions where deception should have been impossible, the phenomena still occurred. Objects moved without contact. Sounds originated from within structures that were being directly observed. Physical disturbances happened in ways that could not be easily traced to any visible cause. And each time it happened, it reinforced the same uncomfortable pattern. The activity did not need opportunity. It only needed her presence. At this stage, even skeptics began documenting details more carefully, not because they believed, but because they could no longer confidently dismiss what they were seeing. The Amherst case had reached a point where it no longer fit comfortably into any single interpretation. It was not behaving like a simple hoax. It was not behaving like a clear psychological episode, and it was not behaving like a traditional haunting either. It was something that reacted, something that adapted, something that seemed to learn how people were trying to understand it. In every attempt to control or explain, it only seemed to shift its behavior slightly, as if it was adjusting to the pressure being placed on it. By the end of this phase, one conclusion had begun to form quietly among witnesses who had spent enough time in the house. Whatever was happening there was not static. It was changing. By this point, the Amherst case was no longer just an investigation. It had become a public argument. People were no longer simply observing what happened to Esther Cox. They were choosing sides. On one side were those who believed something genuinely unexplained was occurring. On the other were those convinced it was deception, hysteria, or a combination of both. And between them sat a growing group of witnesses who were no longer confident in either explanation, because the more time people spent in the house, the more complicated the events became. What started as knocking and movement had turned into something far more aggressive and unpredictable. Objects were now reported moving with greater force than before, not just sliding or shifting, but being thrown across rooms in ways that made the air itself feel unstable. Chairs could tip or move suddenly without any visible trigger. Smaller items would leap from surfaces or strike walls with enough impact to leave audible echoes that carried through the house, and still, it always returned to the same point of focus. Esther Cox. At times, the activity seemed to increase the moment attention shifted toward her. If someone entered a room speaking about her, disturbances would often begin almost immediately afterward. If she became emotional during questioning or observation, the environment would respond in kind. This pattern created a growing discomfort among even the most skeptical observers, because if it was fraud, it was unlike any fraud they had ever been able to identify. And if it was not fraud, then it suggested something far more complex than anything they had a framework for. The situation escalated when more structured testing began. Observers attempted to isolate Esther from environmental influence. They placed her in controlled rooms, removed objects that could be manipulated, and maintained continuous supervision for extended periods of time. Groups of witnesses rotated in shifts to ensure no gaps in observation. The expectation was that under these conditions, any deception would eventually become visible, but the results did not align with that expectation, even in tightly controlled environments. Disturbances continued. Knocking could still be heard from walls and surrounding structures. Objects still moved despite being placed in positions that made physical interference difficult to explain. In some instances, items fell or shifted in ways that appeared to contradict basic physical positioning, as though force was applied without a visible source. These moments created growing tension among the observers, because each time they eliminated one possible explanation, the phenomena adjusted in a way that made the situation more difficult to simplify. Some witnesses began reporting something even more unsettling. The activity appeared to react to skepticism itself. When observers openly challenged or mocked the situation, the disturbances often increased. When calm or neutral discussion occurred, the environment sometimes stabilized temporarily. This pattern was not consistent enough to form a rule, but it appeared often enough to be noticed, and that raised a difficult possibility. If the phenomenon was not random, and not purely tied to physical manipulation, then it was behaving in a way that resembled response, not just reaction to Esther, but reaction to people. At this stage, the case began attracting wider attention. Reports circulated beyond local circles, and the story of the Amherst disturbances began to take on a life of its own. Accounts were written, retold, and debated. Some framed Esther as a fraud. Others described her as a victim of forces she could not control. A smaller number suggested something entirely unknown was involved, though they struggled to define what that meant. Meanwhile, inside the houses where she stayed, the activity continued, and it continued in a way that refused to stabilize. There were periods of calm, sometimes lasting hours or even days. During these times, observers would begin to relax, assuming the phenomenon had finally stopped or weakened. But then, without warning, the disturbances would return, often stronger than before. This cycle created a psychological effect on those involved. Expectation built during silence, only to be broken by sudden escalation. Over time, this made the environment feel less like a series of isolated events and more like a system with its own rhythm. A system that did not fully stop, only paused and resumed when conditions shifted. As frustration grew among investigators, so did attempts to directly challenge Esther's role in the events. Some began openly accusing her of deception. Others attempted more aggressive testing, insisting that if she was the cause, pressure would eventually force a mistake. But the problem remained the same, even under scrutiny, even under stress. Even when isolated and closely observed, the phenomena did not behave in a way that clearly revealed a human mechanism. It either avoided detection entirely or operated outside the conditions they were able to control. This led to a growing sense of division among witnesses who had initially arrived with similar expectations. Some left convinced it was fraud that had never been fully exposed. Others left convinced they had witnessed something that did not fit normal explanations. And a few left without any conclusion at all, only the memory of events that seemed to shift slightly every time they were recalled. But within the house itself, one pattern never changed. Esther remained the center. Not always as an active participant, not always as a visible cause, but always as the point around which the activity organized itself. And as long as she was present, the disturbances continued to respond, not randomly, not evenly, but in a way that suggested something was still there, still observing, still adjusting to the people trying to define it. And that is where the case entered its most controversial phase, because the question was no longer just what was happening, it was whether anything would ever behave consistently enough to be proven at all. By the time the Amherst case reached its final stage, something important had changed. It was no longer just about what was happening inside the house's Esther Cox stayed in. It was about what people were willing to believe after seeing it. The reports had become too many, too consistent in certain details, and too contradictory in others. Some witnesses described events that matched almost perfectly. Others remembered the same moments in completely different ways. And in the middle of it all stood Esther, still tied to every account, yet never fully explained by any of them. The disturbances continued, but they were no longer escalating in the same way. Instead, they became irregular. Periods of complete silence would stretch longer than before. Then, without warning, activity would return for short bursts, knocking movement. Sudden impacts before fading again. It no longer felt like escalation. It felt like fading attention. Some witnesses interpreted this as exhaustion. Others believed it meant the phenomenon had lost intensity over time. A few suggested something more unsettling, that whatever had been present was no longer fully engaged with the environment. As if it had stopped responding in the same way. As if it had begun to withdraw. Eventually, direct investigation slowed. The intensity of observation decreased. People who had once gathered in groups to witness the events stopped returning. Life in the houses Esther stayed in gradually returned to something closer to normal, but normal in this case was always relative. Because even after the major disturbances ended, the case itself did not disappear. It followed Esther in a different way now, not through physical events, but through memory, testimony, and argument. Some insisted she had been the source all along, consciously or unconsciously producing the effects, through psychological or physical means that were not understood at the time. Others believed she had been the focal point of something external, something that had attached itself to her presence and reacted to emotional or environmental triggers, and a smaller group refused both explanations entirely, suggesting that the case represented a category of phenomenon that simply did not fit existing definitions. No final answer ever resolved the debate. no definitive proof ever ended the discussion, and that uncertainty is what kept the Amherst case alive long after the events themselves had stopped, because unlike many stories that end with discovery or resolution, this one ended with something far more uncomfortable. It ended with ambiguity that could not be fully removed. Over time, Esther Cox's name faded from public attention, but the accounts of what happened around her remained in circulation. They were retold, analyzed, questioned, and reframed through different theories. Each generation tended to interpret the case differently, but none were able to fully eliminate the contradictions left behind. Even today, the Amherst disturbances are often discussed as one of the earliest documented poltergeist cases, not because they provide answers, but because they resist them. There is no agreed mechanism. No confirmed cause. No final explanation that satisfies every account. Only a collection of testimonies that overlap in some places, diverge in others, and always return to the same central figure. A young woman who appeared to be at the center of events she could not fully control or could not fully explain, or perhaps both. And that is where the case ultimately leaves us. Not with certainty, but with a pattern that repeats across. Every retelling, something happens. It focuses. It reacts. And then, eventually, it stops responding. Not because it is understood, but because it is gone, or at least no longer visible in the same way. And the question that remains, long after Amherst itself has faded into history, is not what caused it. It is whether whatever was there ever needed to be understood at all. Or whether it simply existed long enough to be noticed, and then learned how to disappear.